Daniel had always been a creature of habit. For the past 3 years, every Tuesday morning started exactly the same way. He'd wake up at 6:30, take a shower, get dressed in whatever comfortable clothes he could find, and drive down to the little coffee house on Maple Street. It wasn't the closest one to his apartment, and it definitely wasn't the cheapest, but there was something about the place that felt right. Maybe it was the way the morning sunlight came through those big windows, or the smell of fresh coffee beans being ground. Or maybe it was just that corner seat by the window that nobody else seemed to want. Daniel was 32 years old, working as a graphic designer for a small advertising firm downtown. His life wasn't exciting, but it wasn't bad either. He had a decent apartment, a reliable car, a few good friends, and a job that paid the bills without stressing him out too much. On weekends, he liked to go hiking in the nearby hills, and sometimes he'd meet up with his college buddies for drinks or a movie. It was a simple life, predictable and safe, which was exactly how he liked it after years of chaos in his 20s. Every Tuesday he'd order the same thing: a medium cappuccino with an extra shot of espresso, no sugar, just the way he'd learned to drink it during a summer trip to Italy years ago. He'd take his laptop out of his bag, open up whatever design project he was working on, and spend a couple of peaceful hours creating before heading to the office. The baristas knew him by name. The regulars would nod at him when they came in. It was comfortable, familiar, easy. And then one ordinary Tuesday morning in late September, everything shifted. The door opened and she walked in. Daniel didn't look up right away. He was focused on adjusting the color palette for a restaurant logo he was designing. But something made him glance toward the entrance. Maybe it was the way the air in the room seemed to change, or maybe it was just coincidence. Whatever it was, when he looked up, he saw her. She stood in the doorway for just a moment, looking around the coffee house like she was trying to decide if this was the right place. She had dark hair that fell just past her shoulders, and she was wearing a long gray coat that looked like it had seen a few winters. But it wasn't what she looked like that caught his attention. It was something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. A feeling, strange and powerful, that started in his chest and spread through his whole body. He knew her. Somehow, impossibly, he knew her. But that made no sense at all, because Daniel was absolutely certain he'd never seen this woman before in his life. He had a good memory for faces, especially after years of studying visual design, and her face wasn't one he recognized. Yet the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like seeing someone from a dream you'd forgotten years ago, or hearing a song that reminds you of a memory you can't quite reach. She moved toward the counter, and Daniel watched without meaning to. She walked with this slight hesitation, like she wasn't completely sure of herself, but also with a quiet determination that said she wasn't going to turn around and leave. She carried a vintage leather satchel over her shoulder, the kind that looked like it had traveled through multiple countries and had stories sewn into its seams. When she reached the counter, she spoke so softly to the barista that Daniel couldn't hear what she ordered. She smiled, though, a small, genuine smile, and something about it made his heart beat faster. He forced himself to look back down at his laptop screen, feeling ridiculous. He was acting like a teenager with a crush, not a grown man who'd been through relationships and heartbreaks and knew better than to get worked up over a stranger in a coffee house. She took her tea, chamomile, he noticed when the barista called it out, and walked past his table. For one brief second, he thought she might look at him, but she didn't. She chose a seat 3 tables away, near the bookshelf that was filled with old paperbacks customers had left behind over the years. She set her bag down, took out a journal and a fountain pen, actual fountain pen, not the cheap disposable kind, and began to write. Daniel tried to focus on his work. He really did, but his eyes kept drifting over to her. He watched the way she paused sometimes, pen hovering over the paper, thinking about what to write next. He watched the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when it fell forward. He watched the way she'd occasionally look up and out the window, as if she was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. The strangest part was that feeling never went away. That sense of recognition, of familiarity, of something important happening even though nothing was actually happening at all. It was like his soul recognized her even though his mind didn't, which was a completely crazy thing to think, but there it was anyway. When she finally got up to leave about an hour later, Daniel felt an unexpected sense of loss. She gathered her things, put her journal carefully back in her bag, and walked out the door without looking back. The coffee house suddenly seemed emptier, even though it was actually more crowded than when she'd arrived. Daniel sat there for a long time after she left, staring at his laptop screen without really seeing it. He told himself he was being foolish, that he'd probably never see her again, that even if he did, she was just a stranger who happened to choose the same coffee house on the same morning. Nothing more than that, but the next Tuesday she came back. Same time, same order, same table. And the Tuesday after that? And the one after that. For weeks, Daniel watched her from across the room, never working up the courage to say anything, always feeling that strange pull of recognition that made absolutely no sense. He learned her patterns without meaning to. He knew she preferred that same spot by the bookshelf. He knew she wrote for exactly 1 hour before leaving. He knew she sometimes smiled at whatever she was reading, these small secret smiles that made him wonder what was going through her mind. He was waiting for something, though he didn't know what. A sign, maybe. The right moment. The courage to cross those few feet between their tables and say hello. He didn't know that everything was about to change, that on a rainy Tuesday morning fate would finally push them together in the simplest, most ordinary way possible. The rain started early that Tuesday morning, one of those heavy autumn rains that came down in sheets and made everything gray and wet. Daniel almost stayed home. He stood by his apartment window, coffee mug in hand, watching the water pour down and wondering if he really wanted to drive across town in this weather. But something pulled him out the door anyway. Some feeling he couldn't ignore that today was important, that he needed to be at the coffee house no matter what. When he arrived, the place was packed, more crowded than he'd ever seen it. Apparently everyone else had the same idea, seeking shelter and warmth and hot drinks on this miserable morning. His usual corner seat was taken by a woman with 2 small children. Every other table was occupied too, people hunched over their laptops and phones, couples talking in low voices, students with textbooks spread out everywhere. Daniel ordered his cappuccino and looked around helplessly. There was literally nowhere to sit. He was about to give up and just take his coffee to go when he spotted an empty chair. At her table, she was there, same spot by the bookshelf, writing in her journal like always. But today there was only one other chair at her table, and it was empty. Daniel's heart started pounding. This was it, wasn't it? The moment he'd been unconsciously waiting for. The universe basically pushing him forward because he was too scared to move on his own. He stood there for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 seconds, holding his hot cup and trying to decide what to do. He could still leave, take his coffee and go sit in his car until a table opened up. Nobody would think anything of it. But his feet were already moving, carrying him toward her table before his brain caught up with the decision. She looked up when his shadow fell across her journal. Her eyes were brown, warm, and a little surprised. Up close he could see tiny freckles across her nose that hadn't been visible from 3 tables away. "Excuse me," Daniel said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Would you mind if I sat here? Everywhere else is taken." She glanced around the coffee house, confirming what he'd said was true, then smiled. "Of course not. Please sit down." Her voice was soft but clear with the tiniest hint of an accent he couldn't quite place. West Coast, maybe, or somewhere that had smoothed out her words into something gentle and easy. "Thank you," Daniel said, setting his cup down and pulling out the chair. "I've been coming here for years and I've never seen it this crowded." "The rain brings everyone inside," she said, closing her journal and setting her pen down beside it. "It's nice though, cozy." They sat in slightly awkward silence for a moment, the kind that happens when 2 strangers share space but aren't sure if conversation is wanted or welcome. Daniel opened his laptop, pretending to focus on work, but he was hyper-aware of everything about her. The way she wrapped both hands around her teacup, the small silver ring she wore on her right hand, the fact that her journal had a worn blue cover with a tree embossed on it. "I've seen you here before," she said suddenly, and Daniel's head snapped up. She was looking at him with this expression that was both curious and slightly amused. "Tuesday mornings. You always sit in that corner by the window." "I'm a creature of habit," Daniel admitted, feeling his face get warm. "Same time, same drink, same seat. It's probably boring." "I don't think it's boring," she said. "I think it's nice. Having rituals, places that feel like yours." She paused, then extended her hand across the table. "I'm Elena." "Daniel," he said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm and warm, and that feeling of recognition surged through him again, stronger now with actual physical contact. They started talking, and it was easy in a way that surprised them both. She told him she'd moved to the city about 4 months ago for work, that she was a freelance writer working on her first novel, that she'd found this coffee house by accident and it had become her favorite place to write. He told her about his graphic design work, about how he'd lived here for almost a decade now, about his Tuesday morning routine that had become sacred. 20 minutes passed like 2. They discovered small things they had in common. Both preferred tea to coffee at night. Both had tried and failed to learn guitar. Both thought the best time of day was early morning before the world got too loud. Then Elena mentioned where she'd grown up, a small town in the Midwest that she'd left when she was young, and something clicked in Daniel's memory. "Wait," he said, sitting up straighter. "What town exactly?" "Riverside," she said. "It's tiny. You've probably never heard of it, but Daniel had heard of it. He'd more than heard of it. He'd grown up there too. "I'm from Riverside," he said, and watched her eyes go wide. "You're kidding." "I'm not. I lived there until I was 18, then moved here for college." They stared at each other, both trying to process this impossible coincidence. Elena leaned forward, her tea forgotten. "What school did you go to?" she asked. "Roosevelt Elementary, then Riverside Middle, then the high school. What about you?" "I went to Roosevelt too," Elena said slowly, "but only for first grade. We moved to California halfway through the year because of my dad's job." First grade, Roosevelt Elementary. The pieces were floating in Daniel's mind, trying to connect. He'd been 6 years old in first grade. That was 26 years ago. The memories from that time were fuzzy, disconnected, like scenes from a movie he'd watched too long ago to remember clearly. "Who was your teacher?" he asked. "Mrs. Patterson. She had that classroom with all the windows and the reading corner with the big pillows." Daniel's breath caught. "I had Mrs. Patterson too. First grade." They sat there in stunned silence, the noise of the crowded coffee house fading into background static. They'd been in the same class. 26 years ago, they'd sat in the same room, learned to read from the same teacher, played on the same playground. And neither of them had any memory of the other. But that feeling, that strange recognition he'd felt since the first moment he saw her, suddenly made a different kind of sense. Not a logical sense, but something deeper. Something that lived in the part of his brain that remembered things his conscious mind had forgotten. "Do you remember anything specific from that year?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to pull up those ancient memories. "There was a playground castle we used to play on, and Mrs. Patterson had this stuffed bear named Buttons that we could hold if we were having a bad day. And there was this one girl who moved away, and I remember we all made her cards." He opened his eyes and looked at Elena. "That might have been you." "I got cards when I left," she confirmed. "I kept them in a shoebox for years." The rain continued to pour outside, but inside the coffee house in their small corner by the bookshelf, something extraordinary was happening. Two people who'd been strangers minutes ago were realizing they'd never truly been strangers at all. They'd shared space and time 26 years earlier, their lives crossing in ways they'd both forgotten, and now here they were again, brought back together by nothing more than chance and rain and the need for a place to sit. Neither of them knew it yet, but everything was about to change. After that rainy morning, Tuesday meetings became something they both looked forward to all week. But it didn't stay limited to Tuesdays for long. Within a few weeks, they'd exchanged phone numbers, and suddenly they were texting throughout the day. Little things at first. Elena would send a photo of something funny she'd seen. Daniel would share a design he was working on. Then the texts got longer, more personal, conversations that would have been easier to have in person but somehow felt safer in writing. They met up outside the coffee house too. On a Saturday afternoon, they went to a vintage bookstore downtown, and Elena showed him her favorite section, the dusty poetry books that nobody else seemed to want. She bought a collection by someone he'd never heard of, and when she read him a few lines in the store's tiny cafe, he found himself watching her mouth form the words more than actually listening to the poetry itself. Another time, Daniel took her to this little art supply store he loved, the kind of place that still sold things by hand instead of in plastic packages. He showed her his favorite sketchbooks, the ones with thick cream-colored paper that felt expensive but weren't really. Elena bought one for herself and said she wanted to try drawing again, something she hadn't done since she was a kid. But the most important meetings were still at the coffee house, where they'd made it their mission to piece together that lost year of first grade. They both went home and dug through old boxes and closets and storage units, looking for anything from that time. Daniel found his first grade class photo, and his hands actually shook when he looked at it for the first time in decades. There were 22 kids arranged in 3 rows, all with missing teeth and terrible haircuts and clothes their mothers had picked out. And there in the front row was a little girl with dark hair and a shy smile who had to be Elena. He texted her the photo immediately, and she called him instead of texting back. "That's me," she said, and he could hear the wonder in her voice. "Oh my goodness, Daniel, that's actually me. I'm right there." "You're in the front row," he said. "I'm in the back. The one who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else." She laughed. "You look like you were plotting your escape." "I probably was. I hated having my picture taken." Elena found things too. She brought a small box to their next Tuesday meeting, and inside were treasures from that year. A report card with Mrs. Patterson's handwriting, a painting she'd done of her family, a little clay pot she'd made in art class that was lumpy and uneven but had somehow survived 2.5 decades, and a cross-country move, and then there were the photographs from her 7th birthday party in October. "My mom took so many pictures that day," Elena said, spreading them out on the table between their coffee cups. "I'd completely forgotten about most of these." Daniel looked through them slowly. There was young Elena in a purple dress blowing out candles. Elena with a group of girls all holding pieces of birthday cake. Elena's mom helping her open presents. And then, in the background of one shot, barely visible but definitely there, was a small boy with messy hair holding a paper plate. "That's you," Elena said, pointing. Daniel stared at the photo. "I was at your birthday party. You were invited. Probably everyone in our class was invited. That's what kids do at that age. But being invited and being there were different things. It meant his parents had driven him over. It meant he'd played with these kids, probably run around Elena's backyard, maybe even given her a present. All of it erased by time and the thousands of other memories that came after. More pieces started falling into place. Elena remembered a reading project where they had to pair up with a partner. She couldn't remember who her partner had been, but she remembered sitting on the floor of that reading corner, the one with the big pillows, working on something together. Daniel had a vague memory of the same thing, of feeling nervous because he wasn't a strong reader yet and hoping his partner wouldn't notice. "What if it was us?" Elena asked. "What if we were reading partners?" "It's possible. It's more than possible. Think about it. Mrs. Patterson probably paired us up alphabetically or randomly, and we sat there together, 2 6-year-olds who had no idea they'd meet again 26 years later in a coffee house. They talked about the playground castle too. That structure of wood and metal that had seemed so enormous when they were small. They'd both played there during recess, both been part of the group of kids who created elaborate pretend games. Daniel remembered being a knight. Elena remembered being an explorer. They might have played together dozens of times. "I gave someone a drawing I'd made," Elena said suddenly. "I remember that. It was toward the end of the year before we moved. I'd drawn this picture of a dragon and I gave it to someone in our class because they said they liked dragons." Daniel felt something stir in his memory. "I had a dragon drawing when I was a kid. I kept it for years. It was in my room and I remember looking at it sometimes and wondering why I'd kept it. What happened to it? We moved when I was 12. A lot of my old stuff got thrown away or lost in the move. I remember being upset about losing that drawing, though. I'd completely forgotten about that until just now." They looked at each other across the table, and the air between them felt charged with possibility. What were the odds? What were the actual mathematical odds that 2 6-year-olds would meet, share a year of their lives, separate for over 2 decades, and then end up in the same city, in the same coffee house, on the same morning? "Do you believe in fate?" Elena asked quietly. Daniel had never really thought about it before. He'd always figured life was just a series of random events, choices, and chances that added up to whatever you ended up with. But sitting there with Elena, with all these rediscovered memories spread out between them, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm starting to think maybe there are connections we don't understand. Things that tie people together even when they don't know it. Like invisible strings," Elena said. "Like invisible strings. As autumn deepened into winter, they kept discovering more. Not just about that shared first grade year, but about all the years that came after." They realized they'd both almost gone to the same college but chose different schools at the last minute. They'd both traveled to Japan in their 20s, though 3 years apart. They'd both lost a parent to cancer, Elena's father when she was 15, Daniel's mother when he was 28. But beyond the coincidences and shared experiences, they were discovering each other as they were now. Daniel learned that Elena was funny in this dry, unexpected way. That she was afraid of birds but loved thunderstorms. That she could cook amazing pasta but burned everything else. That she was working on a novel about two people who meet in different lifetimes, which seemed almost too on the nose given their own story. Elena learned that Daniel was quieter than he seemed at first. But once he was comfortable, he talked about ideas and dreams with this intensity that surprised her. That he was terrible at remembering to eat lunch when he was working. That he secretly wrote poetry sometimes but never showed it to anyone. That he'd been hurt in his last relationship and had built walls around himself that he was only now starting to take down. They weren't just piecing together their past. They were building a present moment by moment, conversation by conversation, Tuesday by Tuesday and then every other day too. And neither of them wanted to admit it yet, but somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about solving the mystery of their childhood connection. It had become about something much scarier and more wonderful. It had become about falling in love. By the time spring arrived, Daniel knew he was in trouble, the kind of trouble that kept him awake at 3 a.m, staring at his ceiling and replaying every conversation they'd had, the kind of trouble that made him check his phone constantly, hoping for a text from her, the kind of trouble that made his chest ache in a way that was both wonderful and terrifying at the same time. He was falling in love with Elena, and he didn't know what to do about it. The problem was his last relationship. It had ended 2 years ago, and it had ended badly. Her name was Rachel, and they'd been together for 3 years. He'd thought they were building toward something permanent, maybe even marriage. He'd been ready to propose when she told him she'd been seeing someone else for months, that she was sorry, that she'd tried to make it work, but her heart was somewhere else. The betrayal had hurt worse than the breakup itself. After Rachel, Daniel had sworn off serious relationships. He'd dated casually a few times, gone on apps, and let friends set him up, but he'd kept everything surface level. Nobody got too close. Nobody got past the walls he'd built. It was safer that way. Lonelier maybe, but safer. And then Elena had walked into his life, or back into his life, and every single one of those walls was crumbling without his permission. He tried to tell himself it was just friendship, that he was making it into something it wasn't. They'd never even kissed, never held hands except for that one time when she was getting out of his car and steadied herself with his arm. Never done anything that would definitively cross the line from friendship into something more. But the feelings were there anyway, huge and undeniable and growing stronger every day. He knew she felt something too. He could see it in the way she looked at him sometimes, like she was trying to figure out a puzzle. In the way she'd lean in close when they talked, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and floral. In the way she laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones. In the way she'd text him goodnight every single evening, without fail, even if they'd just spent the entire day together. But neither of them said anything. They danced around it, kept everything in this safe zone of friendship, while the unspoken feelings built up like water behind a dam. Daniel talked to his best friend about it one night over beers. His friend listened to the whole story, from the coffeehouse meeting to the first-grade connection to where things stood now, and then he just shook his head. "Man, you've got it bad," his friend said. "I know. So what are you waiting for? Tell her how you feel. What if it ruins everything? What if she doesn't feel the same way, and then things get weird and I lose her completely? What if she does feel the same way and you're both sitting around being scared for no reason?" Daniel didn't have a good answer for that. Elena was dealing with her own fears. She talked to her sister on the phone one Saturday morning, trying to put into words what she was feeling. "I think I'm falling for him," she admitted. "Actually, I know I'm falling for him. I fell a long time ago. I'm just scared to do anything about it." "Why are you scared?" her sister asked. "Because what if I'm wrong? What if I'm seeing something that isn't really there? What if he just wants to be friends and I make everything awkward by admitting I want more? Has he given you any reason to think he just wants to be friends?" Elena thought about it. About the way Daniel looked at her sometimes like she was the only person in the room. About the way he remembered everything she told him, even small stupid things. About the way he'd shown up at her apartment last week with soup when she mentioned she wasn't feeling well, even though it was out of his way and he had a deadline at work. "No," she said quietly, "but I've been wrong before," her sister sighed. "You're thinking about Kevin." She was thinking about Kevin, her ex-boyfriend who'd told her he loved her and then moved across the country without even saying goodbye. Who'd made her feel like she was too much, too intense, too invested. That had been 4 years ago and she'd thought she was over it. But apparently the fear of being hurt like that again was still there, lurking under the surface. What if I tell Daniel how I feel and he pulls away? What if I lose what we have right now? What if you tell him and it turns out to be the best decision you ever made? Her sister countered. They went on like this for weeks, Daniel and Elena, both feeling the same thing but too scared to say it out loud. They kept meeting up, kept talking for hours, kept building this connection that was so obviously more than friendship to everyone except, apparently, themselves. The turning point came on an evening in April. They'd gone to see an art exhibition at a gallery downtown, photographs by some famous photographer Elena loved. After, they walked through the city as the sun set, not ready to say goodbye yet. They ended up at a small park, one of those pocket parks that city planners squeeze between buildings, with a few benches and some trees and a fountain that wasn't turned on yet for the season. They sat on a bench, shoulder to shoulder, watching people walk past, dog walkers and joggers and couples holding hands. The air was finally warm after a long, cold winter, and everything felt full of possibility. "I love this time of year," Elena said. "Everything starting over. Everything getting a second chance." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, the way the fading sunlight caught her hair, the small smile on her face, the peace in her expression. And something inside him just broke open. "Elena," he started and then stopped, not knowing how to continue. She turned to look at him, her expression questioning. "Yeah, I need to tell you something. And I'm scared to tell you because I don't want to mess this up. But I think not telling you is worse than telling you at this point." Her eyes went wide and he saw something flicker across her face. Hope maybe, or fear, or both. "What is it?" she asked softly. But before he could answer, his phone rang. His boss calling about some emergency with a client presentation. Daniel swore under his breath, apologized, and had to take the call. By the time he was done, 10 minutes later, the moment had passed. Elena said she should probably get home anyway. She had writing to do. They walked to the parking lot in slightly awkward silence, and when they said goodbye, Daniel felt like he'd missed the most important opportunity of his life. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling again, calling himself every kind of coward. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow he'd tell her everything. No more waiting, no more fear. But when tomorrow came, the words still wouldn't come out, until the Tuesday morning when Elena reached across the table, touched his hand, and changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 months after they'd first sat together at that shared table. The coffee house was quiet today, just a handful of regulars and them. Spring had fully arrived outside, trees blooming and birds singing and the world feeling new again. Daniel sat across from Elena, watching her write in her journal like he'd watched her do so many times before, and he felt that familiar ache in his chest. He'd been trying to work up the courage for weeks now. To just say it, to tell her everything he was feeling. But every time he got close, fear grabbed him by the throat and the words died before they could get out. Elena set down her pen and looked up at him. Really looked at him with those brown eyes that seemed to see right through all his defenses. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Of course." She took a deep breath, and he could see her hands trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about this a lot, about us and how we met and everything that's happened, and I keep coming back to this one thought." "What thought?" "I think I've been looking for you my whole life," she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness he could see in her face. "Even when I didn't know it was you I was looking for." Does that sound crazy? Daniel felt like someone had knocked all the air out of his lungs. No, it doesn't sound crazy at all. Because when I walked into this coffee house that first day, something in me just knew. I didn't understand it then, and I'm not sure I completely understand it now, but I felt it. Like I was coming home to a place I'd never been. He reached across the table and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. The touch sent electricity up his arm, and from the way her breath caught, he knew she felt it too. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. "I felt the same thing. You walked in, And it was like I was remembering you before I actually remembered you, like some part of me had been waiting for you to show up again. I'm scared, Elena admitted. I'm terrified, actually. But I'm more scared of not saying this, of wondering what if for the rest of my life. Say what? She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. I'm falling in love with you, Daniel. Maybe I've been falling since that first Tuesday, or maybe since we were 6 years old and I gave you that dragon drawing. I don't know when it started. I just know it's happening and I can't pretend it's not anymore. For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. Could only stare at this woman who'd just said everything he'd been too scared to say himself. And then the relief hit him so powerful it was almost painful. I'm terrified too, he said. The last time I let myself fall like this, I got hurt. Bad, and I swore I wouldn't do it again. But then you showed up and all my rules and walls and promises to myself just stopped mattering. So what does that mean? Elena asked, and he could hear the hope and fear mixed together in her voice. It means I'm falling in love with you too. I think I have been for months. And I don't want to be scared anymore. I don't want to waste any more time dancing around this when we could be actually living it. Elena's eyes filled with tears, the good kind, and she laughed even as one spilled down her cheek. Really? Really? I want to try this, us, for real. Not just as friends who are secretly crazy about each other but too scared to admit it. I want to actually do this. Even though it's scary, especially because it's scary. Because the things worth having are usually the scary ones, right? She laughed again, wiping at her eyes. When did you get so wise? About 5 seconds ago. I'm making this up as I go. They sat there, holding hands across the table in their coffee house, grinning at each other like fools. The barista glanced over and smiled like he'd been watching this story unfold for months and was glad to see it finally reaching this moment. So what now? Elena asked. Now? Now we just start. We go slow if we need to. We talk about our fears when they come up instead of hiding them. We figure it out together. I like that plan. Good, because I don't actually have a backup plan. They left the coffee house together that morning, really together for the first time. Daniel held her hand as they walked to their cars, and it felt right in a way he couldn't explain. Natural, like this was exactly where his hand was supposed to be. Can I take you to dinner this week? He asked. Like an actual date. Not just hanging out as friends, but pretending we don't want more. I would love that, Elena said. Friday? Friday's perfect. The months that followed were everything and nothing like Daniel had imagined. Everything because the feelings were just as strong, the connection just as powerful. Nothing because the reality of actually being with Elena was so much better than anything his imagination had come up with. They took it slow like they'd promised. No rushing, no skipping steps. Their first date was dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant, where they talked until the staff started putting chairs up on tables. Their first kiss happened 2 weeks later, on Elena's doorstep after a movie. And it was awkward and perfect and everything a first kiss should be. They had fights, small ones at first about stupid things like whose turn it was to pick the restaurant, or whether to watch his movie choice or hers. And then bigger ones about real things like Daniel's tendency to shut down when he was stressed, or Elena's habit of overthinking everything until she'd convinced herself something was wrong when it wasn't. But they worked through it. They learned each other's patterns and triggers. They learned when to push and when to give space. They learned how to fight fair and apologize sincerely and forgive completely. 6 months after that Tuesday morning confession, Daniel helped Elena move into a bigger apartment, and somehow half his stuff ended up there too. It just made sense. Why maintain 2 places when they spent every night together anyway? A year after that, on another Tuesday morning in their coffee house, Daniel got down on one knee beside their usual table. The barista had helped him plan it, made sure the place was quiet, made sure Elena's favorite tea was fresh and hot. Daniel pulled out a ring he'd spent 3 months choosing. A simple band with a small emerald because Elena had once mentioned she'd never liked diamonds. I've been waiting my whole life to find you, he said, his voice shaking just a little, and I don't want to spend another day not being your husband. Will you marry me? Elena said yes before he even finished the question. They got married the following spring in a small ceremony in the same park where they'd almost confessed their feelings that evening a year and a half earlier. Elena's sister was her maid of honor. Daniel's best friend was his best man. Mrs. Patterson, their first-grade teacher, came to the wedding after Elena tracked her down and explained their story. She was 82 years old and cried through the entire ceremony. At the reception, Daniel gave a speech where he tried to explain what it felt like to find someone you didn't know you'd lost. Everyone talks about soulmates like they're something mystical, he said, looking at Elena. Like the universe creates two people specifically for each other and throws them together. Maybe that's true. Or maybe soulmates are just two people who choose each other, over and over, every single day, who see each other's flaws and fears and broken pieces and say, yes, this person, I choose this person. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Elena walked into my life like a memory I'd been waiting to relive. But she wasn't a memory. She was a promise that the best things in life are worth waiting for, worth being scared for, worth taking the risk, and I'm so glad I took that risk. I'm so glad we both did. Years later, they would tell their story to friends and family, and people would always say the same thing. What are the odds? How is that even possible? It's like something out of a movie. And Daniel and Elena would just smile and say that maybe some connections are deeper than logic or probability. Maybe some people are meant to find each other, no matter how long it takes or how impossible it seems. They never knew for sure if fate had brought them together or if it was just an incredibly lucky coincidence. But it didn't really matter. What mattered was that they'd found each other twice. Once when they were too young to know what they had, and once when they were old enough to hold on tight and never let go. On Tuesday mornings, they still went to the coffee house. Same place, same table by the bookshelf. Daniel with his cappuccino, Elena with her chamomile tea. They'd work on their projects, her writing and his designing, occasionally reaching across the table to touch hands just because they could. And sometimes, when the light came through the windows in just the right way, they'd look at each other and remember that first moment, when she walked in like a memory he'd been waiting to relive and changed his entire life without even knowing it. That was their story. Simple and complicated, impossible and inevitable. A love that had been waiting 26 years to finally happen. And it was perfect.